Okay, how's it going, everybody? So, we are going to read this fourth part of the on the Irish question by Jenny Marx. It's the fourth article here that she wrote. This is, it was written in London, March 18th, 1870. Let's go ahead and get into this. As I announced in my last letter, Mr. Moore, an Irish member of the House of Commons, yesterday questioned the government on the treatment of the Fenian prisoners. He referred to the request made by Richard Burke and four other prisoners held in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, and asked the government whether it considered it honorable to hold the bodies of these men after having deprived them of their senses. Finally, he insisted on a, quote, full, free, and public inquiry, end quote. So here was Mr. Gladstone with his back to the wall. In 1868, he gave an insolent, categorical refusal to a request to hold an inquiry made by the same Mr. Moore. Since then, he has always replied in the same fashion to repeated demands for an inquiry. Why give way now? Perhaps it would not be a bad idea to admit to being alarmed by the uproar on the other side of the channel. As to the charges leveled against our governors of prisons, we have asked them to give a full explanation in this connection. The latter having unanimously replied that all this is sheer nonsense. Thus, our ministerial conscience is naturally satisfied. But after the explanations given by Mr. Moore, these are his exact words, it appears, quote, that the point in question is not exactly satisfaction, that the satisfaction of the minds of the government derives from its confidence in its subordinates, and therefore it would be both political and just to conduct an inquiry into the truth of the jailers, end quote, statements. Of the jailer's statements, end quote. One day he says this, next day he says that. His yesterday's views today he will shelve. He now wears a helmet and now a top hat, a nuisance to others, a bore to himself. That was it seemed like a poem that Jenny Marx put in there. But he does not give way at last without making reservations. Mr. Moore demanded a, quote, full, free, and public inquiry, end quote. Mr. Gladstone replied that he was responsible for the form of the inquiry, and we already know that this will not be a parliamentary inquiry, but one conducted by means of a royal commission. In other words, the judges in this great trial, in which Mr. Gladstone appears as the main defendant, are to be selected and appointed by Mr. Gladstone himself. As for Richard Burke, Mr. Gladstone states that the government had learnt of his insanity as early as January 9th. Consequently, his honorable colleague, Mr. Bruce, the Home Secretary, lied outrageously by declaring in his open letter of January 11th that this information was untrue. But Mr. Gladstone continues, Mr. Burke's mental disturbances had not reached a sufficiently advanced stage to justify his release from prison. It must not be forgotten that this man was an accessory to the blowing up of Clerkenwell Prison. Really, but Richard Burke was already detained in Clerkenwell Prison when a number of other people took it into their heads to blow up the prison in order to free him. Thus he was an accessory to this ridiculous attempt, which it is thought was instigated by the police, and which, if it had succeeded, would have buried him under the ruins. Moreover, concludes Mr. Gladstone, we have already released 2 Fenians who went mad in our English prisons. But interrupts Mr. Moore. I was talking about the 4 insane men detained in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. But that as it may, replies Mr. Gladstone, there are still 2 madmen less in our prisons. Why is Mr. Gladstone so anxious to avoid all mention of Mountjoy Prison? We shall see in a moment. This time the facts are verified not by letters from the prisoners, but in a blue book, published in 1968 by order of Parliament. After the Fenian skirmish, the English government declared a state general emergency in Ireland. All guarantees of the freedom of the individual were suspended. Any person, quote, being suspected of Fenianism, end quote, could be thrown into prison and kept there without being brought to court as long as it pleased the authorities. One of the prisons full of suspects was Mountjoy Convict Prison in Dublin, of which John Murray was the inspector and Mr. M. Donnell was the doctor. Now what do we read in the Blue Book published in 1868 by order of Parliament? For several months, Mr. M'Donnell wrote to Inspector Murray, protesting against the cruel treatment of suspects. Since the inspector did not reply, Mr. M'Donnell sent 3 or 4 reports to the prison governor. In one of these letters, he referred to, quote, certain persons who show unmistakable signs of insanity. He went on to add, quote, I have not the slightest doubt that this insanity is the consequence of the prison regime. Quite apart from all humane considerations, it would be a serious matter if one of these prisoners, who have not been sentenced by a court of law but are merely suspects, should commit suicide. End quote. All these letters addressed by Mr. McDonnell to the governor were intercepted by John Murray. Finally, Mr. McDonnell wrote direct to Lord Mayo, the first Secretary for Ireland. He told him, for example, quote, there is no one, my lord, as well informed as you yourself are on the harsh discipline to which the, quote, suspect prisoners have been subjected for a considerable time, a more severe form of solitary confinement than that imposed on the convicts. End quote. What was the result of these revelations published by order of Parliament? The doctor, Mr. McDonnell, was dismissed. Murray kept his post. All this took place during the Tory ministry, when Mr. Gladstone finally succeeded in unseating Lord Derby and Mr. Disraeli by fiery speeches in which he denounced the English government as the true cause of Fenianism. He not only confirmed the savage Murray in his functions, but also, as a sign of his special satisfaction, conferred a large sinecure, that of, quote, registrar of habitual criminals, end quote, on his post inspector. In my last letter, I stated that the anonymous reply to Ross's letter, circulated by London newspapers, emanated directly from the Home Office. It is now known to be the work of the Home Secretary, Mr. Bruce. Here is a sample of his ministerial conscience, end quote. As to Ross's complaint that he is obliged, quote, to wash in water which has already been used for the convicts' ablutions, the police magistrates Knox and Pollock have declared that after their careful inquiry it would be superfluous to consider such nonsense, end quote, says Mr. Bruce. Luckily, the report by police magistrates Knox and Pollock have been published by order of Parliament. What do they say on page 23 of their report? That in accordance with the prison regime, a certain number of convicts use the same bath one after the other, and that, quote, the guard cannot give priority to O'Donovan Rossa without offending the others. It would therefore be superfluous to consider such nonsense. Thus, according to the report by Knox and Pollock, it is not O'Donovan Rossa's allegation that he was forced to bathe in water which had been used by convicts, which is nonsense, as Mr. Bruce would have them say. On the contrary, these gentlemen find it absurd that O'Donovan Rossa should have complained about such a disgrace. During the same meeting in the House of Commons, in which Mr. Gladstone declared himself ready to hold an inquiry into the treatment of Fenian prisoners, he introduced a new coercion bill for Ireland, that is to say, the suppression of constitutional freedoms and the proclamation of a state of emergency. Theoretical fiction has it that constitutional liberty is the rule and suspension an exception, but the whole history of English rule in Ireland shows that a state of emergency is the rule and that the application of the Constitution is the exception. Gladstone is making agrarian crimes the pretext for putting Ireland once more in a state of siege. His true motive is the desire to suppress the independent newspapers in Dublin. From henceforth, the life or death of any Irish newspaper will depend on the goodwill of Mr. Gladstone. Moreover, this coercion bill is a necessary complement to the land bill, recently introduced by Mr. Gladstone, which consolidates landlordism in Ireland, with appearing to come to the aid of the tenant farmers. It should suffice to say of this law that it bears the mark of Lord Dufferin, a member of the cabinet and a large Irish landowner. It was only last year that this Dr. Sangralo published a large tome to prove that the Irish population has not yet been sufficiently bled, and that it should be reduced by a third if Ireland is to accomplish its glorious mission to produce the highest possible rents for its landlords and the largest possible quantities of meat and wool for the English market. Yeah, so that's Jenny Marx on articles on the Irish question. So yeah, that's number 4, I believe, released in 1870. Let's see. Yeah, number 4, released March 18th, 1870. So thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxist Saw. Hit me up there. YouTube, Marxist Saw. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. And thank y'all for tuning in. Y'all have a great day. In the Dadagoy.